Hey guys, Danny Garcia. This is the assignment from Module 3, Case Studies for Hurricanes. The hurricane I chose to critique is the case study on the Galveston, Texas hurricane of 1900. The reason why I chose this hurricane is because to date it is still the deadliest hurricane in the history of the United States of America, and there are some pretty important messages to be taken from the fallout of this hurricane. The key theme to this case study is that there's nothing more important, particularly in areas that are vulnerable, is to have an evacuation plan. The issue here with the Galveston, Texas hurricane is that I'll just start here with the critique of the case study. Stage one of what you're taking away from as a city manager is that there is no seawall to help protect from the storm surge of a hurricane in place already. There is no communications with the mainland, with the exception of couriers. Maybe some rudimentary telecommunications. There may have been a telegraph, but once there's a storm surge or any kind of winds, odds are that that technology gets lost. And more importantly, there was no evacuation plan. Stage two of the critique, it goes on to discuss how there was a very lackadaisical approach to evacuation and to preparations for the storm. Obviously, being that it's a coastal part of the United States, it does have a history of hurricanes, but the residents who lived there didn't feel the need or the urgency to prepare for or evacuate for this hurricane. Also, they mentioned that the resources weren't stockpiled. There was minimal food and water stored away in the event of a long-term disaster, and there was no means, as you'll see as we get farther along, there was very limited means to evacuate prior to the hurricane, and once the storm surge started to get too high, you'll see that people who were left on the island were isolated. Stage three, people did begin to evacuate once the storm surge began, and once word got around that there was a pending storm, people did begin to evacuate, and the primary means to evacuate was by train. There was a train that went from the city island of Galveston over to the mainland of Texas. But by the morning of the storm surge actually washes away the train tracks. And when this happens, according to the case study, there was a train with 95 occupants on board, and it was stranded on the train tracks. They were trying to get a secondary train to come help to transfer over some of these occupants, but it never materialized. And as it were, 10 of the occupants were able to get out of the train and swim to safety. The other 85 ended up dying in that train. And what ended up happening was those 10 people, they managed to find their way, as the text explains, to a lighthouse that also ended up being one of the main points or one of the main structures where a lot of the people hold themselves up during the hurricane. At that point, the mainland was no longer accessible to Galveston. And obviously there were no communication. So who was left on the island by this point, early in the morning of the day of the hurricane, ended up getting left there throughout the remainder of the hurricane. And in stage four, as they wrap up post-storm, they discuss how the resources that the island city had were minimal, particularly water, food, shelter. And what ends up happening at this point is the primary mission of those left on the island, first responders, is to do search and rescue and essentially find bodies. The majority of the infrastructure, buildings, and everything was decimated. There was very little freestanding structures left, and for the majority of the infrastructure was destroyed. What I was able to find, I found a couple pictures, and I'm going to post it on my response here for this assignment. One of the pictures shows the epicenter of the storm, exactly where it hit, and the other picture that I have that I'm posting on here shows the aftermath of the city of Galveston after the hurricane. And as you can see, everything is decimated. There are no buildings, there's no structures, very few structures. A couple of brick structures survived, but very few on an island. And obviously the death toll was extreme, with between 8,000 and 12,000 people dying. I lived in South Florida during Hurricane Andrew. I was in high school during Hurricane Andrew, which is one of the strongest hurricanes to hit the United States. And I can tell you firsthand that to see the devastation from the Galveston hurricane, it is way more extreme than what I experienced down in South Florida back in 1992. But that'll be another story for another assignment. I found a couple different articles online. I found one website was called theeyewitnesstohistory.com, And what it does is it gives a little information about the hurricane that the text kind of covers. That the storm came in, obviously, from the Gulf of Mexico. It had winds as high as 135 miles per hour. In today's day, it would be categorized as a Category 4 storm. There was a 15-foot storm surge, and the majority of the island was 8.7 feet above sea level. So as you could imagine, the storm surge was pretty severe. To date, it's still it's still classified as one of the worst natural disasters in the history of America. There was very little warning back during those days. Meteorologists didn't have that much forewarning for a storm of this size, of any size really. By mid-morning, clouds on the 8th of September, clouds started to develop. It started to rain. There had already been somewhat of a storm surge and high winds, but it wasn't until the mid-afternoon that the true brunt of the hurricane hit. And what this article actually had was a first-person account of one of the survivors who ended up sending a letter to his brothers in a different part of the United States post-hurricane. His name was Milton Elford, and he was a young man living in Galveston. He was there with his mother, father, and his young nephew. And he was the only one of his family to survive the storm. And his account of it, he goes on to explain how the house that they were living in, they left to go to a larger house in the neighborhood, assuming they'd be safe. It was built on a brick foundation high off the ground. By about 5 in the afternoon, he explains that the fence outside started to break up and the wreckage of other houses were coming up against their house. The reason why they decided to try to stay in place in that home during the hurricane is because there was a larger home just next door, and the people who were at that house decided that they were not going to evacuate either, and so they assumed they would be safe in a house that was similarly built. He goes on to explain how once the water surge broke into the home, they were wading in chest-deep water. The house actually was torn apart. It was a wooden structure, got ripped to shreds. And as he was floating on wreckage during the remainder of the storm, he said, and by this point it's afternoon, evening, and night, and where there was no light, so he was essentially just floating in the dark. And it wasn't until the next morning that the people of the town were able to see exactly how bad the storm actually was. He says that he goes on to say that when the storm did finally pass, he went to the city hall to see the chief of police to get some help to recover corpses. Around noon the next day, on the 9th of September, the firemen and other first responders began to bring in corpses. They said by the wagon load, about a dozen at a time, laid them down in rows to be identified, and the next day they were badly decomposing. They were loaded onto boats and taken to sea, only to end up washing back onto the beach. At that point, they decided to bury them or burn corpses. At one point, there were so many corpses that it was almost as though they were just throwing debris in a pile and burning it, is what he explains in his first-person account. I found another article on from, I believe this is the weatherchannel.com, and it gives some of the same basic information about type of storm, size of storm, storm surge, and that sort. But what I found interesting was that there was actually the meteorologist in charge of the local weather bureau lived on the island of Galveston. His name was Dr. Isaac M. Klein, and he was made aware about a day before the storm hit Galveston that there was a storm out in the Gulf, and he got this information from reports from Florida. The weather conditions the day before the storm were relatively calm. There were some rough seas and high waves, but the majority of the people, based on the blue skies and very little forewarning, the majority of them ended up staying. He did send a telegram to Washington saying that he believed that a large part of the city was going to be underwater, and he predicted a heavy loss of life. As it turns out, he was one of the few people who took to the beaches trying to warn residents to seek higher ground. 48 people took shelter in his home. As the hurricane approached, obviously the winds grew pretty intense. The tide rose very quickly. It speaks about the gusts of winds and how precarious their situation was. Those who actually decided to go and stay in his house and wait the storm out, there were 48 people who took refuge in his house, and 32 of them drowned in the storm surge, including his wife. It estimated that over $30 million worth of damage took place in Galveston, which by today's terms probably wouldn't seem like a lot. It probably, with inflation, is probably comparable to what was experienced during Hurricane Katrina. but the loss of life is astronomical relative to some of the other natural disasters that we've experienced over the last 15, 20 years in the United States. That's what I got. Thank you, guys.